put your finger in the air when you want to speak on a particular topic. I'll try and make sure absolutely everybody gets a chance to speak when they want to. We've got until about 11:45 for this session, and then we'll suspend and move on to the next session. Those of you that are joining us, for the first time you speak, if you can say which organisation you're representing. So I'd like to start by considering the operational impacts at different points in the supply chain, like packaging, producer, wholesale, retail, import, etc. Let's talk about labelling first of all, and identification and traceability of DRS scheme items. Anyone want to start off on their thoughts on those issues? Colin Smith.
Colin Smith, Scottish Wholesale Association. Just to put a bit of context, Scottish Wholesale Association represent the wholesalers, not just here in Scotland, but also that operate in England as well. We are, in essence, the wheels to the food and drink industry, so we are distributing all the beverage containers, for the sake of this discussion, to the 4,972 convenience stores across the length and breadth of Scotland, the 39,000 food service outlets, restaurants, pubs and clubs. Just picking up, you were mentioning about own label, wholesalers, to differentiate their model from their competitors, do produce own label products. So we are now not just wholesalers distributing goods to those outlets, we are now obligated within the scheme, or DRS, as producers. And one of the arguments is that wholesalers aren't just a homogenous group of wholesalers. We are producers, importers and indeed retailers. So just putting that in the context, the own label product, which currently gets distributed across the UK, is now in essence going to be differentiated, because we've now to produce a Scottish version of that bottle of water and an English version of that bottle, which is totally unique. And picking up on Jim's last comment, integrated supply chain, absolutely. We are now creating a trading border here in Scotland, and it's between Scotland and England, and Scotland and the rest of the EU. And when we're talking about European countries, France and Spain, the Baltic states, these are countries that are divided, not internal borders that we are now creating here. So it creates a lot of difficulty for us as manufacturers, producers.
It's between the countries on the continent and countries in the UK?
Because you're talking about geographical countries, cross-border trading between countries, not cross-border trading within a country on its own. We're creating
but they're all in the EU, so they don't have any kind of customs kind of borders between those countries anyway.
No, but in terms of the fraud prevention of non-deposit bearing stock being transported into countries that have a deposit scheme.
Okay. Carry on. Sorry. Andrew Ty.
Hi, I'm Andy Ty from the Scottish Beer and Pub Association. So we represent brewers across Scotland and across the UK, producing the vast majority of beer sold in Scotland and the UK, and members who operate around 20,000 pubs across the UK. So specifically on labelling, as Colin mentioned, one of the challenges around labelling is if we have a separate label in Scotland for DRS Scot, DRS materials, then of course that creates challenges for brewers who currently operate a UK-wide or an EU-wide supply chain with a common label. So for example, if you're a Scottish brewer, you will not basically produce to order, but based on forecast demand for your product. And if you've got a Scottish-specific label and some stock, you may not be able to fulfil an order that comes in from another EU member state or from the rest of the UK as well. So it's potentially a missed opportunity in relation to exporting. Similarly, of course, if you overproduce stock, then of course you've got the risk of wastage as well. So whilst I think everyone recognises that to mitigate against the fraud risks, there's going to have to be an element of specific Scottish labelling. That then does create a lot of challenges in relation to restricting potentially choice and opportunity as well.
Okay, Gavin Partington.
Thank you very much. Soft Drinks Association, we represent producers of soft drinks, juices and bottled waters in the UK. thanks for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I should say in context that we as a sector are supportive in principle of a DRS system for across Scotland, England and Wales. We do think that Scotland going first poses challenges, particularly around labelling. In all honesty, some of our members haven't finally decided how they're going to address that. Some may believe that they can go for Scotland-specific labelling for some product lines. For some other companies, that will not be financially or economically viable. I know of at least one premium soft drink producer who currently operate 28 SKUs, 28 product lines in the UK marketplace. They've told me that if a Scotland DRS goes ahead on its own, ahead of the rest of GB, in all likelihood they will probably not send 23 of those 28 product lines to Scotland because it's simply not economically viable to do so. They will focus on their largest product sale lines to actually deliver to the Scotland marketplace. I think there's an additional challenge here in relation to the 20 pence, and I know that that was touched upon in your earlier session this morning. Setting the rate at that level poses a number of challenges. It's counterintuitive, frankly, to actually set a target for industry, but then actually dictate what the mechanism for delivering that is, rather than allow it to be flexible according to the operation of the scheme administrator. But specifically on the labelling issue, depending how this is addressed, you will have a circumstance in which it provides an additional economic incentive for some unscrupulous operators, unfortunately, to trade product into the Scottish marketplace that has not had a deposit paid on it. 20 pence raises the barrier for that. It means that a 12-pack of can of Coke or beer, for example, could actually have an extra £2.40 on it, and that increases the economic incentive for that unscrupulous trade. Unfortunately the case, but I fear it makes it more challenging, and we want to see this scheme work, so we feel duty-bound to sort of highlight issues that poses challenge.
I mean, we touched on that in the last session, and we come to you as well, Jim. Jim says, you know, we don't want to see it not happen. We just want to see it managed in a way that the fraud is averted, minimised, whatever. How do you see that been done?
So I think the first thing is that the intuitive way to address this issue would be to allow the system administrator to set the fee, because that administrator is being set a target and they should therefore have the flexibility to use the fee lever to dictate delivery of that target. The second thing is that I think the government's own analysis suggested that a lower fee level to start with might be desirable in terms of meeting the initial targets. And if you set a lower fee level, you would diminish the economic attraction of, as I say, those unscrupulous operators from seeking to buy non-deposit paid product in the UK, in England, and then ship it across the border. So that's one aspect. I think certainly you would want to have greater investment in the SEPA resources for monitoring of product movement across the border if government is determined to proceed with the 20 pence level.
Jim Fox.
I think it might be helpful for me just to say how complicated this might be so that people understand what we're dealing with here. So I'm representing the Food and Drink Federation here, but I've got a better understanding of Coca-Cola and their stock keeping units. So I'll speak about, for this particular case, about Coca-Cola in this case would have 700 different stock keeping units for Scotland, 700. The artwork changes for that would be threefold. So there would be, for every stock keeping unit, you need shrink film, you need trays, and you need the actual cans or bottles themselves. All of that artwork costs a lot of money to be changed, but not only does it cost money, it costs time. And if when you deal with these kind of things, you know that the print works and the artists and things like that have got a limited capacity. What we're doing at the moment is we're going to get everyone to dump all of this stuff on a fairly small group of suppliers. So it extends the whole process. So where you might have an artwork change in a normal set of circumstances that might take you weeks.
Are we talking about a barcode change? The
whole thing has to change.
Well,
So,
why does the rest of the artwork have to change if it's just a case of...
well, first of all, the barcode probably would need to be accompanied by some written declaration to the consumer. So, because a consumer can't read a barcode, so it would need to say something like, this is a deposit container, or this is for deposit in Scotland, or it's not for sale in England, or some version of that. So it does need to, and then when you change that, you move everything else on the container, etc. That particular part, when you've made it, has to be stored somewhere. Now, you have a GB-wide group of products at the moment that would need to not double in volume, but certainly double in complexity. So in terms of how logistics works, it's something called the square root rule. So it's the square root of what your products are, is the extension of your range. Then you need more warehousing, and then you need more product lines, and you need more production space and more time. It's a very, very costly thing. And it gets to the stage where you end up have to make a really big decision about whether you can keep products in the market or whether you take products out. And so, you know, we can't make those decisions at the moment very easily because we don't see the final regulation. And people are pressing us to make decisions about whether a pack should have a different code on it or a different... And we'd love to make that decision. But right now, unless you see the end regulation, you can't commit the business to hundreds of millions of pounds worth of artwork changes.
Realistically, the amount of litter produced by food and drink companies that end up in our environment is also a very costly thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, you know, obviously it's not borne out.
We're not here to fight against DRS.
Yeah.
We're here. We are genuinely here to get the right deal. All I'm trying to say is keep this in context. If you want to change the way Scotland does business within GB, and that's what you're doing primarily, you know, you need to understand that it takes time for producers to make that change. It's not that we want to go slowly. The capacity of the people all the way down that supply chain is limited. If we want to get artwork done tomorrow for one park, that's easy. We just go and phone up the supplier and say we want this change. When you want to do it on thousands of times, you know, across the marketplace with the beer guys and the spirit guys and the wine guys.
Timescale as well.
Timescale and capacity.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So when we come on to talk about timescale, it's not just about how long it takes to change the artwork on a pack. It's the impact of all of these pack changes on the whole marketplace.
Mark, you wanted to come in.
Just thinking, are there not branding advantages there, though, to have different artwork? So, you know, you could have Coke, and then you could have Scottish Coke with a wee sort of, you know, DRS symbol on it. I mean, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that a good thing? I know it creates. You're saying it creates time for somebody to draw the symbol and everything and make new artwork. But are there not any branding advantages?
We can do things like that. So we can do a slightly different park in England and in Scotland at the moment on a limited scale. So if one park looks better in Scotland in one way and different in England, we can do that. And it's one park at a time. It's not 700 parks with 2,100 pieces of artwork.
Stuart, you had actually had your hand up a wee while ago. Are you still got a question? And I realised that I forgot to come back to you. Sorry, Stuart.
That's all right. Come here. You're forgiven. I just wanted, and I've now acquired two questions in the meantime. I wanted to go back to Colin Smith, who appeared, and this is the opportunity to perhaps clarify, to say that there are unique issues about intrastate borders that are different. And I just wondered, in principle, how that works in the States, where every one of the states can have a different level of sales tax. Some have none, some have quite high levels. The same is true in Canada. I suspect Faroes and Denmark's not a good example because the geography separates them, but I know there's significant differences. So I kind of ask about that principle thing. That is quite different from deposit return. I accept that's a different thing. And just simply for Jim Fox, I don't think I can walk down a single aisle in the supermarket without seeing promotional labels which are introduced at short notice. Every single aisle. So I just wonder how often are producers changing their labels anyway, because I have a very strong impression, do forgive me, that it's a very regular and standard part of the marketing efforts, and that this would... I'm not buying quite what you say, is really what I'm saying. I think you can address that, perhaps, if you were perhaps to give us some numbers, not necessarily today, but I just see the packaging changing all the time on lots of products, so I'm just not clear. But first, Colin
Colin
Smith, if I
first
may.
to answer your first point, and then to Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I think what we need to remember is that, or recognise actually, is that Scotland is and the distribution of food and drink within the UK, actually, not just within Scotland, is totally different from any other country, European, America, Canada, New Zealand, where it might be. And that uniqueness is that there is this wholesale supply chain, this £2.9 billion industry that sits in the middle between the producers and the manufacturers and the retailers and food service outlets. Whereas in a lot of European countries, or most European countries, or in America, it's a direct supply. So it's the producer manufacturers directly supplying those.
Just intrude. Are there not distribution points in West Lothian that supply the Republic of Ireland, for example?
There are, and that's where.
So therefore, you know, we're doing it.
Yeah, but we're not having to differentiate the product offering. We're offering the same bottle of Coca-Cola to the whole of the UK market, Ireland, and indeed potentially some of them export that UK product into Europe. And we don't have a physical border or a trading border with those countries that we supply. It's the way we've always done business for the last 100 and odd years. But now we are actually having to say, right, when my members that are based in Scotland are buying product, they've got to know, in essence, how much they're going to sell in Scotland, so they buy that Scottish product, and how much they're now going to be selling in England, so they can buy a separate product just for the sale down there. This is totally unique. This has never been done before. And on the scale that Jim was talking, he's got 700 products. My members, because I've gone out and surveyed them, in fact, we've produced an impacts assessment report that we will present to committee, but we haven't yet finalised it because we're waiting on the Scottish Government coming back to us on some new information that's only come to light in the last 4 weeks. But now I've lost the train of thought. 700 products for Coca-Cola. Our members are stocking currently about 4,000 beverage products. And now, if you want them to continue servicing England, as many of our members do, they're now going to have to double those items. So where are they going to suddenly find this additional warehouse capacity? And I know we're going to talk on costs later, but you know, just to give you a shock impact, Jim, in the previous session, £15,000 is the deposit value on a trunket of Coke. Our members are suddenly going to have to find another £298,000 a week just to buy the same amount of beverage containers that they currently buy to keep their business running. I don't know where we're supposed to find £298,000 a week. It will eventually come through in the sale of material, but at the initial start-up, that's what it is.
I come to Jim Fox to address your other points, Stuart.
Sure. A couple of things. I'll just go back to the interstate thing just briefly because I've got something to add. I think in America, Canada, Australia, you have a geography difference. It's a big distance sometimes, and that protects to some extent on interstate movements. Also, the logistics in these countries are much more about direct-to-store delivery from the producer. Whereas in this country, we have a wholesale strand of our supply chain, and it's a well-developed wholesale. So we supply into wholesalers, or we don't even supply to Tesco stores. We supply to the regional distribution centre. So there's a different level there that isn't present in America, Canada, Australia. So that's that question. How often do we change labels? There are two different answers to that. First of all, I would suspect that when you go into a store, you will see lots of promotions, but they're not all label change promotions. They're price promotions primarily with shelf edge stickers that make it look different. The actual pack isn't necessarily different to the pack you bought the week before. When we do change labels, so let's say when Coca-Cola sponsors the World Cup, for instance, and they do a nice sort of can specifically for the World Cup, the planning for that has gone on for 6 to 9 months beforehand, and the stock has been made, and it gets phased in with careful collaboration between us and our retailers so that we get it on the shelf at the right time, and then it goes from the shelf at the right time and the normal stock comes through. It's quite a major operation to get that one pack on the shelf at the right time in the right format. This changes the whole market, and that's why I keep coming back to the same point. This, in scale terms, what we're asking is far different from what we normally see on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, I've got some... So Ewan McDonald-Russell want to come in on the back of that initial question, and then I'm going to some of the other members who've got questions around this.
Thank you, Convener. Ewan McDonald-Russell from the Scottish Retail Consortium. Just a couple of points of substantiation on Gavin's point about brand and ranges, and that our members sell an awful lot of own brand products. They are having exactly those conversations, and they are looking very closely at small ranges and that and trying to determine if they will still be profitable after all these changes come in. The complexity challenge of this for us is enormous. There are obviously a huge quantity of things. That second point, I think Jim explained really well on behalf of us, and I won't repeat it. That point about RDCs, our members tend to have a distribution hub that will cover Scotland, but it will also cover other bits. Northern Ireland, sometimes the Republic, will cover the north of England as well. And in those places, this will require segregation of lines. We will have our Scottish products, and then there'll be products elsewhere. That is not impossible, and I wouldn't want for a second to say this can't be done, but I would note that it is difficult to do, it is complex to do, and to make sure it's right. And that's because at the final stage of this, every product in store, and we're talking at the end of the day 2 billion containers a year, each of the containers that are in store have to be right so we are compliant with the regulations that have been laid down. So that requires a labour cost, it requires a segregation. This is not by any means impossible, but it's very hard for us to do. And from my members' perspective, this has to be all sorted before we even think about the take-back side. So it's an enormous challenge, and I think that Jim's very well expressed the detail of why it's so complex.
Okay, Jenny Hume.
To briefly say, so we do recognise from an environmental NGO point of view that this brings logistical challenges for people, for stakeholders within industry, but I think we do need to keep in context that, Colin, you mentioned we've been operating business like this for the last 150 years, but we're now living in a recognised climate emergency, and we can't keep doing business like we have done for the last 150 years. So deposit return is a tiny part of the overall solution of what we're going to have to implement, and I think that's why it's really positive. We've spoken a lot with Jim and Ewan about this, and you know, I think whilst recognising there are challenges, we really welcome that they're participating in the IAG and finding solutions to these problems.
Okay, we'll go to some of the members that have asked to contribute. Rachel.
Thank you, Convener. It's just on the theme that we're talking about. We're hearing a lot of challenges here about labelling, and in the last session we heard a little bit about fraud. Do you think that the DRS scheme, which everyone seems to agree with, should be paused and rolled out as a UK-wide scheme with cooperation from the Scottish Government and the UK Government?
Andrew Ty.
I think, you know, in simple terms, yes. You know, I think that is everybody's desire for the most efficient DRS scheme would be to have a single scheme across the UK. You know, we recognise from a Scottish Government perspective that there's some uncertainty in Westminster around timings and when they would be ready, and we appreciate that. But, you know, for us and our members, the closer that timescale is to one another, if not at the same time, certainly the better to mitigate a lot of these challenges that we're talking about today, about separate SKUs, about fraud risk.
We have a climate emergency, and the Scottish Government have got very challenging targets to do with emissions and waste.
Yeah, absolutely. And
can we afford to wait as a society?
And that's the balance, and we certainly appreciate that. But I also think as well, of course, there's wider, we might come on to an EPR reform as well that's due to come in from 2023 that will hopefully supplement and complement what's been put in place here as well.
Mm-hmm. Callum.
Callum Duncan, Marine Conservation Society. Thanks for the opportunity to give evidence, and appreciate that there's a willingness to, everybody wants to deliver deposit return scheme, and it sounds like we're sort of talking a lot about the detail. which is understandable because that's the logistics and the practical measures. But just to pick up on what Jenny was saying, and following up with what Mark was saying, you know, Scotland has to be zero carbon 5 years ahead of the UK. We've got we've got a small window where we have to make these changes, and you know, I would just I was encouraged by the exchange in the first round table, because I don't think I was hearing that people want to have the Scottish Government or Scotland drag its heels because it's waiting for, you know, a wider system and context. And it's important that the systems harmonise across the UK, but I think it's important that Scotland just gets on and delivers, because we have to meet these more challenging targets. We heard from Zero Waste Scotland, you know, there's a potential for saving 4 million tonnes of carbon over 25 years. If I may, because I don't know how the questions will go, but there was some talk about glass in the first session. I understand 1.2 million tonnes of that would be through glass, and we're really keen for glass to be in the system, because as we heard from Jenny, it's a top 3 item on the beaches. It's a big problem in terms of waste there, and I was also quite interested to hear about this idea of that people were nostalgic. You know, it was a nostalgic thing to take back of glass bottles, but it was still 50% return rate. 48% of householders still don't have curbside recycling and access to glass.
Questions on its head. Rather than pausing a sort of Scottish system, as Rachel has suggested, that there should be pressure being put on the UK government to catch up with Scotland in order for them to actually, I mean, is that, I mean, I'm seeing some nodding heads round the table. Gavin Partington.
Point, Convener, we've consistently asked civil servants at DEFRA to work extremely closely with their colleagues in the Environment Department in Scotland and in Wales, because actually we see the merit of that. An optimum situation for us, and to your point, Callum, about the timetable here, is that an ideal situation would be for the whole of the UK, well, certainly the whole of GB, to have a cross-country DRS system in place. But we accept the political reality is that Scotland is advanced, and so our real drive at the moment is to make sure that the Scottish scheme is the best designed scheme with the best chance of success. And that's why we genuinely make these points around the fee level, around the timetable. We think is pressing, frankly. The timetable of delivery by April 2021 is very challenging indeed, and I think unlikely to succeed in a successfully launched scheme at that stage. That is the political reality here. We want this thing to work. To do that, there are some genuine issues which we urge the Scottish Government to address.
Jim, you want to come back in?
You asked about the difference between England and Scotland. We want, honestly, to respect the devolved powers of Scotland. You know, there's absolutely nothing here about trying to align with England for any other sake other than practicality. I think Jenny asked about a climate emergency. We want to respect the environmental concerns, because we don't want the litter or the recycling rates that are pretty much stalled at the moment to remain that way. But we also ask you to recognise where business is at the moment. You know, we've got a GB or a UK supply chain that will be very difficult to break up. And that's what you're asking us to do, to actually separate England from Scotland in a very physical sense. You're trying to do that, and you're asking us to do that in against a background of Brexit. That's the first time it's been mentioned today, where all of our business are concerned about you know, how things will go in the next 2 to 3 years. Really, really difficult decisions being made right across industry at the moment. You're also asking us to make up our minds and be positive about this. When you, as a government, as Scottish, I know you're not the government, you're a committee, but the Scottish Government is asking us to make up our minds. When they can't give us clear responses on extended producer responsibility, you know, is it or isn't it part of EPR? You know, if we're in DRS, will we be excluded from exempt from APR? You can't give us clear indications about VAT, and that's an absolute essential part of how we plan our business. So yeah, we could put more pressure on the UK government, but that's not the ideal time, because we go into government departments now in Westminster and there's not a lot of other work going on. So it's really, we're trying to talk to people that are facing the other way. And equally, I believe that when Scottish Government officials go to Westminster at the moment, it's even difficult for them to get attention. So, you know, we're asking you to be more, you know, understanding of industry's position. If we wanted to join up in a GB fashion, that would cause concern, I think, at Scottish Government and NGO level in Scotland, and we don't necessarily expect that. Perhaps we should be talking about some kind of compromises for some of the parts of this, at least for the next 2 years. That's where I think we need to be.
I want to move on, and there's lots more to say about this, but I want to move on to the impacts in terms of recycling infrastructure. We've got some members around, we've got some people around the table that are from waste management, and what's the potential impact of this in terms of, I guess, capacity, cost, but also the upsides as well in terms of the volume of material that might make it into the recycling chain. Stephen, do you want to, and then I'll come to Colin.
Yes, Stephen Freeland, the Scottish Environmental Services Association, which represents the waste management contractors. So yeah, there are two aspects to this. I mean, clearly the waste industry and local authorities have been highlighted as potential losers in the system. And that's basically because material which we've been handling and processing is going to be diverted off to the scheme administrator instead. So there is the impact there. Waste infrastructure has been built up in the last few years to meet our waste regulations. A lot of recycling capacity is there at the moment. But where the opportunity would be is we've got this infrastructure, should we not at least be looking to utilise it as part of the deposit return scheme? And that's where the conversation with the Scottish Government seems to be stalling. We don't know what their intentions are. We'd have thought by trying to keep scheme costs to a minimum, we should be utilising existing systems, existing expertise, which could be tweaked and modified to fit into the deposit return scheme.
On that?
Well, we've got recycling facilities which can sort a whole range of materials which come in through the commingled blue bin, curb recycling bin, and separate it out into different grades. So it's the same process for deposit return, which is looking to collect metal cans and plastic bottles. It requires some sort of sorting at the back end before that material then goes to market. So there is that capability in the system already. We are not too sure from Zero Waste Scotland whether they want, or the Scottish Government, as to whether they want to build brand new, shiny kit from scratch.
Is already there in the existing infrastructure to handle the proposed, you know, increase in materials coming in by DRS.
The tonnages would be there because it's the same, you're just displacing this one system for another, so the tonnage capacity is there. It would require tweaking, though, because it's a different composition of material that's coming into the system. So that's where the challenge is, to make sure that the system would have to be modified in some way to take this new composition of material that's coming in. And that's where the challenges are. We don't know what those system parameters and boundaries would be in a deposit return scheme world.
Debbie, Mish wanted to ask.
Push that a little further, because you said, Stephen, about there'd be, if I understand you right, I can't quote exactly, sorry, this was, I was catching the either convener as well, but similar capacity. Surely one of the points about deposit return is to increase the capacity of if everything is included, of glass litter in playgrounds and glass on beaches and plastic being chucked out on the side of motorways or whatever it is. Surely the idea, there's a lot of litter around which is going to increase the capacity for recycling and indeed for remanufacturing.
There's two angles there, yes. I mean, I'm not convinced by there's going to be a huge amount of additional stuff coming.
Just figures show it. Sorry, anyway, go on.
So there is two elements there. Is the stuff that's lost to landfill bin and stuff that's lost to litter, yeah, will have to come through a system. I think the industry would be equipped to handle that if we have the opportunity to. We're not too sure if we do or do not. And you're right, the second strand from that is at the back end. It's all very well collecting material and sorting it and processing it. It then has to be reprocessed back into plastic chips and such like. So yes, there is an opportunity with this cleaner stream of material coming through. Not
at the moment.
At the moment, that's we're relying on export to cover that.
Yeah.
So the big thing to square that would be to ensure that we can invest in this country to deliver that. But I don't see anything in the regulations that say the scheme administrator or the Scottish Government are applying any pressure to ensure that happens. It's all focused on the front end. There's nothing to say you shall ensure this stuff retains in Scotland.
So obviously we want to minimise environmental impacts, so actually reprocessing, if it's happening in Scotland, is actually going to meet that objective.
It would help, particularly
As well
given
as
the fluctuations in the Chinese markets and markets being closed internationally. We're struggling to find outlets for this material. It would help if more of this was sorted and processed in the country, but it's a challenge.
Colin Forshaw.
Hello. Thank you, Convener. I represent Chartered Institute of Waste Management. I'd like to thank Stephen for stealing nearly all my points. However, I can expand on some of them in particular as well, which I think is some good points there. Timescales. So Stephen outlined there about infrastructure. We have capability within the industry at the minute within Scotland specific, which is handling curbside and source segregated recycling materials from local authority and from commercial operations. Similar, although on a much smaller scale, I would say, to the producers, we would have to look at batch processing this material, which then has associated costs in terms of how these facilities function and associated operational costs as well, to keep certain materials separate from the commingled materials. So that needs to be looked at. There is a timescale issue in there as well. We have to look at bringing in new facilities of some form to be able to process this material. It may lead to additional quantity, as you suggested before, and there'll be quality issues as well. Again, you want to try and keep this separate. Stephen hit on a very good point about end market. I operate a facility in Aberdeen. It is a source of constant frustration that the majority of my recycling products have to go south of the border for being processed. To have them north of the border would make a lot of sense and would also help stimulate the market accordingly. I'm sure there's some manufacturers and producers around the table that would be interested in that as well. So that's one aspect we'd like to see from a well-designed scheme. Again, we're coming back to the timeout rollout issues, but I would just like to pick up one point there about the actual tonnage as well. I don't believe it's been adequately modelled, having reviewed the business case as well. I think that's something which does have to be reviewed about the diversion of material from existing good performing schemes across into a DRS, because I do think that underpins a lot of the processing capability from my resource sector that we look at, as well as the producers as well. I think that's a key point for the timescales as well.
Mark, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, there's an interesting discussion there about pure tonnages, but it's also an issue about quality, isn't it? So, you know, what's coming through a commingled waste collection for PET, for example, is pretty dirty. I mean, it's difficult to get the bulk of that back into, you know, food grade PET bottles. So is there an issue that by actually not segregating through a DRS or maybe some other technique, we're actually losing that PET and it's going in to make car parks or resurface roadways or some other kind of low grade usage when it could actually be used as bottles again? I'm struggling to think of how we increase the quality of the recycling and the reuse here.
The quality is critical in the majority of commingled processing plants. We sell various different grades of plastics, PET, HDPE into the market, and they do have to hit a specification for quality. It's the next stage of the processing where we have to get that correct in terms of the cleanliness levels, etc.
Into remanufacturing drinks bottles as a proportion of what's coming through
I don't
your
have any
MRF?
numbers directly in front of me. I'll be happy to supply them to the committee through CRWM at a later juncture if that's possible.
Yep.
Okay. Ben.
Just to summarise on the operational impacts and cost of the system, what we hear from industry is that the DRS as proposed at the moment is going to increase costs significantly to businesses, it potentially is going to decline. There's going to be a decline in choice for Scottish consumers because some retailers may decide not to sell into Scotland. It's going to increase fraud because it's not a UK-wide scheme. And there could be a significant impact on Scottish producers selling elsewhere in the UK because of the additional costs of having a Scottish and UK market. We've also heard that there's not the recycling capacity within Scotland to deal with the plastic waste that the DRS would collect. So is there, we've already seen there's evidence that there's significant business preference for a UK-wide scheme. What I'd like to ask the NGOs, it would appear that the date, we're looking at 18 months introduction of the scheme just prior to the 2021 elections. Is it your opinion that this is a political decision, or is it a realistic decision to bring in a scheme
it's not been political up until this point. I think it's a little bit unfair to ask our guests to make political comment. It's about the operation of it.
Okay, on an operational basis, I think we've talked about the Scottish scheme and a UK scheme and the Scottish Government trying to go further. My question is it realistic, is it sensible that the Scottish Government push ahead for an introduction date of spring 2021, where all the evidence suggests that the timescales are not realistic and we might have a system that's not sustainable and fit for purpose? Would the NGOs suggest that there needs to be more work done to create a UK scheme which would deliver straight away and give longer term benefits?
Is an impossible ask at this stage. If we look at the stage at where the rest of the UK are in terms of deposit return, we've had primary legislation here since 2009. They haven't even managed to get primary legislation. The Environment Bill has just fallen because of the general election. So I know that people within industry would like maybe a bit more time, but I don't think they're asking to wait until the rest of the UK, because I think we all know that the very earliest the rest of the UK could do it is 2023, and that has probably been massively pushed back now because of the general election. So I'm not the person to answer about the ins and outs of the practicalities of the system, but I do know that the industry have been represented on the implementation advisory group for about a year now. People have been talking about this for a really long time. Everything we're hearing today, I heard probably 2 years ago. So I have sympathy that there are challenges, but we can't afford to wait any longer.
But is 2021 realistic?
I think it is. Lithuania introduced it in 6 months, and they got 90% return rates within the first few months.
Callum Duncan.
Jenny's just made a point that I was going to make there about Lithuania managing it in 6 months. I had a bit of an opening gambit, which was environmental, but there's also a business case as well, which I think we've also heard in terms of what we want is we want to increase quality recycling. We want to encourage circular economy businesses in Scotland. We want to use the existing ecosystem of waste sorters and recyclers, and there's lots of social enterprise opportunities there. There are systems I'm sure we could come up with in local communities where, if there are exemptions, there's agreed collection points. The system would help fund the transport cost of the recyclate to adequate recycling facilities, so that cost is not borne by the local authority, which in turn is a taxpayer cost. I can't help but think that in terms of marketing opportunities as well, I mean, Scotland's the only country in the world that has a soft drink that outsells Coca-Cola. and that's on the basis of I'm not making a marketing point, but just to try and sort of flip the narrative in terms of, opportunities there as well. And just to be absolutely clear, I mean, our ideal is harmonised, integrated schemes right across the UK as soon as possible. But if, from an environmental perspective, we're seeing the progress stalling, not happening, as Jenny said, they don't even have the primary legislation in place there in the UK. We need to get on and do it.
And there is a precedent as well, because obviously there's been things environmentally done in Scotland first, like the plastic bag charge, and then the rest of the UK followed on with that as well. So there's precedent for almost a sort of Scotland being a test case for the scheme, and then a follow on. You wanted to come in as well.
If that's okay. Firstly, we have some experience from carrier bags and MUP doing it differently in Scotland, so hopefully there's a bit of that. If I can just run over factually what my members, particularly my members who work in property and planning teams, are telling me of the retail build. So this is dependent on there being a scheme administrator formed and some idea what that looks like. That's a dependency we can't wait for, and that can't obviously be convened until at least May, I think it's April or May next year, when these regulations pass. So once that's all in place, our members have to build a scheme in about 2,500 stores to take back 2 billion containers. That's going to cost us, we reckon, probably about £250 million in total. It's a really significant thing. For about 500 of those stores, we think we're going to need serious work, so that would be store extensions or major refits. That construction work itself is a 6-month project, but in most cases that will have to go through planning, we'll have to go through building warrants. There may be licensing changes if we have to move stores under the Act around that. And that's all before we kind of get into that. Those of you who are noticing that, that means that it's unlikely a lot of the regulatory things we need to pass, which is very different from other examples. We think most of that may not actually be done before April 2021. So what that means is if we commit to that date and the government doesn't move, as it has indicated it might consider, you would have a manual handling system, and that has generally not been very popular when you're talking about, in a supermarket on a Saturday, you're talking to an item every 2 seconds being returned. We've estimated, and this sort of refit process would normally take 5 or 6 years. We think if it's absolutely pushed, if there's a huge focus, and it's what retailers absolutely commit to as they do, it's likely to be at least the middle of 2022 before the physical infrastructure for take-back can be made. And that's just simply based on an outline on those premises. That may be shorter, maybe longer. There is some variability there. There are huge unknowns in this. We don't know, for example, if VAT will apply. But that's just how long we think the build process will take, or certainly what my property experts are telling me.
Actually, Ewan's answered a lot of, or mentioned a lot of what I was going to say. That we have sat in the IAG for the last 7 months and been involved with DRS since 2015 at least. And I don't think there's any disagreement that there is a climate change emergency, and we are all trying to work with Scottish Government to implement the best design deposit return scheme. But as an industry, we are being hampered in giving you the best solution and potentially the quickest solution because of a pre-designed scheme, a scheme that we have been told we've got to operate within and aren't allowed to bring in alternative solutions that could speed it up and actually make it better. And I'll pick on the better part because while certainly my members would want this a UK-wide to prevent all the additional costs and complexity that the scheme brings. Having it UK-wide would actually enable us to capture more recyclate. And
the table, we're talking about a Scotland scheme. How can that be made better?
But the environmental challenge, the environmental groups want us to clean up the environment, to clean up the beaches, etc. I'm saying that there is a solution, that there are options out there to enable us to do that better than just having a Scottish designed scheme or a design that you have laid before us. There's alternatives out there, and the concern that if we go first and don't consider the other options that are out there, England in 2023 or whenever they might go will be putting in place a more technologically advanced system that potentially allows people still to deposit their bottle into a curbside collection system using blockchain technology, QR codes, RFID chips, and whatever else. We have presented, and Zero Waste Scotland are aware of the technologies out there that England will probably go with. And we
technologically advanced scheme. So, what one of those do you think Scotland should be adopting?
That's not for me to say, because this is to be industry-led, and I would need to
well, it is for you to say, because we're asking for your view. So you've said that we should be having a different type of scheme. What kind of schemes should we have that you think England might be introducing down the line that we haven't?
One that is, involves the products having QR codes on it, that then would be scanned at an app and deposited into a curbside bin, as opposed to then having to jump in your car, bus, or whatever to return to retail.
A purely curbside
you could
solution.
You could still, if you there's two alternatives, and this hasn't been examined. Zero Waste Scotland haven't allowed us to look at these alternatives because we have to work within the parameters that Scottish Government have set for us. So I can't go into all the details. Certainly gladly have an open discussion with industry and Scottish Government on the other technological abilities that are available. But you could have it either as curbside, or you could still charge a deposit and you you still put it in your bin. There is opportunities out there.
Okay, you can come to John Lee. You had your hand up a wee while ago.
Thanks, Convener. It was just to touch on the time frame question. With the very best will in the world, we simply don't think the timescale's achievable. From the point of view of project management, the key issue is the dependencies across the supply chain. From a small retailer point of view, we are dependent on our manufacturing colleagues making all the labelling changes, the pack changes. It's not very sexy, but there's a huge issue about whole of systems testing. We have a wholly integrated system, so we would have to test the registration process. We would have to test the IT system. We would have to test that deposits are being reimbursed in a timely fashion. We would have to test that handling fees are being paid out correctly from both automated and manual take-back processes. We would have to test that people's payment details have been encrypted correctly. There is a procurement dependency. So I think there's a general consensus that the scheme administrator won't be formed until around March or April of next year, which would essentially give us a 12-month window to implement and resolve all of these dependencies. So with the best will in the world, and I should say from our members' point of view, there's no real benefit in keep extending the implementation date. However, being realistic, the issue of dependencies and the issue of project management makes the timescale, I can't see it being achieved, to be absolutely frank with you.
Okay, Susan Love.
Just to echo quite a lot of what John said there. So we obviously work on a lot of regulatory matters that affect small businesses in Scotland. So we've got a lot of experience of what needs to be done between government deciding what it wants to do, Parliament passing regulations, and then the next stage after that moving towards implementation and delivery. Now, one example I would use would be the waste regulations that were passed 2014, and those were probably one of the most similar large-scale pieces of regulatory change that affected most small businesses in Scotland, where they had to move to a recycling system. Now, I think there was 2 years from the passing of that to actual to coming into effect for businesses. And in that case, and we used this as a model that was good working with small businesses, because there was a really strong thought put into what the enforcement model would look like, the training required for all the regulators to get it right, the awareness raising and marketing campaign for business. So that was a good example. But that was really just a tweak. It required some action from businesses. This is setting up an entire new organisation that's going to do all of this, a scheme administrator. And as John has said, but it's going to be at least next spring before that's set up. We don't have any experience of our regulations being run by an organisation like this. And although Jenny's right, we have been speaking about this for a long time, but there's no decisions on a vast range of details. So I spoke earlier about the exemptions. If I just think about that scheme administrator needs to be in place, all of the discussions around what all of the exemptions might look like, the text for that, writing the guidance that's going to be for businesses, the marketing campaign. I mean, just based on previous experience and our models of what good regulatory practice looks like in Scotland, it's very, very difficult to see how you can do this well in the timescale. Just lastly, I know that people have referenced how other countries have done it. I don't know what their regulatory practices are, and I would just caution the context we're in. I'm sure we all wish we weren't in the economic context we are, but there are multiple challenges coming down the road at businesses at the moment. And so we can't escape that. There's a lot happening. We're going to ask them to do other things in relation to climate emergency as well. So we just need to be cognizant of the context that we're operating in.
Okay, we have Jim and Andrew wanted to ask, but I'm going to bring in Angus MacDonald. On the issue of timing, you have some additional questions to throw into the mix.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. With regard to the time frame, we've seen some slippage already, I think it's fair to say. I mean, February 21 was the date put forward for some time as the preferable date that DRS would be operational. However, we know that the draft regulations now have the 1st of April. However, the Scottish Government states that the timetable for implementation of the scheme is the subject of ongoing discussion with stakeholders, supported through the Scottish Government's DRS Implementation Advisory Group. The various commencement dates included in the draft regulations are caveated for this reason. So the Scottish Government, I think it's fair to say, would be aware of the need for more slippage. So can I ask the panel members who haven't contributed to this particular section of the debate, how achievable and how appropriate are the timeframes currently proposed by the Scottish Government, taking into account the need to establish, for example, the physical infrastructure, and particularly the counting centres, setting up the administrative processes, establishing the scheme administrator, 1 or 3 or whatever, and bringing into force the enforcement mechanisms that we've already touched on.
Jim, do you want to address any of that?
Yeah, just general timescales. So not sort of going back to this join up with England, but just the practicalities, if you like, of where we are now. So if you imagine that you can pass this regulation by something like March next year, is that that seems to be the timescales that the government's working to. If you imagine then that producers are responsible for putting together a scheme administrator, that means borrowing £26 million. It means lots of other things. So putting that joint proposal together by producers that aren't able to do that in advance because they haven't seen the regulation. So the clock starts ticking from the time the regulation is passed, not from now. We can't do much preparation on this. So you say March, then it's 2 months to get the system administrator, people together, borrow money, set up heads of agreement or whatever the contracts are between them. And then another month or so before Scottish Government ministers approve the scheme administrator, you're then well into summer 2020. So let's say July. If you then put a year on, just a minimum of a year for a really complex implementation, a year puts you into July 2022. And let's say there's a bit of slippage. Now, even a bit of slippage puts you into September, October. If you go past October in the retail trade, it's Christmas and you cannot implement something like that in Christmas. So if you guys get everything together and you deliver the regulation in March and then everything goes smoothly and we have a scheme administrator up and working within 3 months, then there's a chance that you hit 2022 September, October. There's a chance. If you slip on your timescale, then you must give us the latitude to go over into 2022 because Christmas isn't going to work for this.
We're going to move on to talk about EPR. Finn Carson.
Thank you. I just want some comments in very broad terms. The Scottish Government obviously brought forward its Circular Economy Bill, and at a UK-wide level we've had consultation across all the countries looking at the UK packaging producer responsibility system, and we've also got proposals and features of the extended producer responsibility across the UK. Can I have some comments on how you think the DRS system should fit into an extended producer's responsibility, and does that need to be accelerated for the two to work well together?
Andy Ty.
It's been mentioned earlier, actually, and yes, EPR's coming and there's going to be wide reform. I mean, they're talking about consistent collections across local authorities on businesses paying the full cost of packaging being recycled and reprocessed. But really, Jim mentioned it earlier, it's probably the timescales initially with DRS and where that fits in. So DRS has definitely got a part to play with that. But at the moment, of course, there's the double counting element. So producers are going to be paying under the existing regime for PRN and producer responsibility up to 2023. So just to give an example in relation to beer, in 2020, to meet the 80% recycling target for glass under the current business targets and the targets for aluminium and metal, we estimate it will cost around £2.4 million for beer across the beer supply chain that's responsible for that payment. If you think about the producer fees under DRS that will come in potentially from 2021, we're waiting for Deloitte to break down those producer fees by the different material types, but for glass we estimate that will be between 5 and 10 pence. So for beer, that's between 14 to 28 million just for beer. So if producers in Scotland are paying that producer fee as EPR, essentially, to deliver what we want on DRS, then of course if they've also got to pay 2.4 million in EPR costs on top of that, you know, that's an area of double counting that certainly we would want the Scottish Government to work with the Westminster Government to make sure that's not the case. So DRS has definitely got a role to play within EPR, but it shouldn't be on top of EPR costs, I think is the point.
Partington, then comes Jim Fox.
Convener, it's to that point, same point, and we have asked whether or not there's a way of framing the regulations to make some provision for this, to ensure that there isn't double counting. Producers obviously want to fulfil their extended producer responsibility obligations. That's absolutely right, and DRS is a key element of that. But is there a way of ensuring, through liaison with the UK government, that in fact they're not also going to get charged that existing producer responsibility obligation through the existing waste management system? It's also germane, and Jim did refer to this earlier, around VAT for the same reasons. So we wouldn't want to see VAT charged on deposits, and officials have indicated that that's not their objective, but we still don't have any concrete assurances that that isn't going to occur.
Okay, Jim Fox.
EPR, we're really supportive of EPR, and we are all across Europe. We think that this is relatively simple. Anything within DRS should be exempt from EPR. It's a form of EPR, and I think Jenny's already sort of said that. So we're in sort of quite strong agreement around the table about that. And we're quite happy as well that anything that's not actually in the DRS, so the secondary packaging and any packs that are not obligated by DRS, will be caught by EPR. So there's a sort of a tiered system. So anything like shrink film that goes around packaging or cartons that are not in DRS should be caught by EPR. That really needs to be written into the regulation. It shouldn't be just a sort of a half-hearted promise by the Scottish Government that, yeah, it'll be all right on the night. We can't afford that. This is like tens of millions of pounds for our industry.
Okay. Stephen Freeland.
Just on, obviously, we've got deposit return potentially coming in 2021, which is what we're talking about, and EPR coming in 2 years later, it's 2023. The impact on curbside recycling we're talking about, the material diverted from curbside to deposit return, potentially affecting the economic viability of providing and continuing to provide a curbside household recycling scheme in many respects. And we're told that EPR will be a saviour to 2023. All your troubles be solved when EPR kicks in. But we've got this 2-year window where we're being told by the Scottish Government of weather the storm until EPR kicks in, and that would help rejuvenate the fortunes of curbside sort. So there must be some way of potentially dovetailing DRS and EPR rather than this 2-year gap that we're looking at the moment.
Okay. Right. We're going to questions and discussions around everything we haven't really discussed so far on scheme administration and governance. Stuart, do you want to kick that off, please?
Yeah, I thought this was going to be simple, but every contribution is making it more complicated, I must say. And I suppose, totally naively, I'm just wondering why we don't just collect the 20 pence when we sell the product. Has that been looked at? Yeah, as we do with plastic bags.
So I never heard the first bit.
Why don't we collect the 20 pence when we sell the product? I mean, why does the retailer have to pay the wholesaler the 20 pence? Why, you know, in other words, the old purchase tax system rather than the VAT system, where it goes all the way down the system and creates all the complexities and the need for the extra cash flow that we've had. I'm not trying to reinvent the scheme. I'm only trying to establish whether anybody's aware of that sort of approach being looked at. That's all.
I think that's a really simple one. It's a really simple one, Stuart. This whole scheme is about getting the container back. It's not a one-way thing. So VAT is a one-way thing. Purchase tax is a one-way thing. The container, if it followed the container, would still need to be reimbursed with whatever you call it. And therefore, it wouldn't be a deposit return system if it was a tax.
Okay, I may come back to that in my own time.
And so that, I mean, we, within our submission, and you've obviously read it, hence the question, we did put an alternative solution in how the deposit could still flow through the system, but actually not impact all the way through. So it'd be a reverse charge mechanism, the same as VAT is handled within the construction industry. It's basically a paper entry.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so it minimises the cash flow impacts for wholesalers, for retailers, and that 20 pence effectively is then paid to the scheme when the article is sold. So we have put that as an alternative solution within our submission, if you'd care to maybe read it.
Right. One of the things that's emerged, I think from Jim, but from others, was when the administrator is going to be appointed and in post and so on, putting in place a delay. And I really ask the question, therefore, should the Scottish Government be looking at starting the process of setting up the scheme administrator in advance of the legislative framework? Now, before seeking an answer to that, I know that we've just done a climate change bill, now Act, where the just transition that was talked about in that context was actually set up in advance before any legislative. So it's perfectly possible to do that sort of thing if you choose to do it. Would that be something that would be helpful? Would that be something that people in the room would encourage to happen? Bearing in mind that it is ultimately to be a private sector administrator, that nonetheless the midwife could still be the Scottish Government in advance of the legislation. I just wonder if I'm having one of my turns or whether this is a sensible thing to think about.
Gavin Partington.
Perhaps I could help, Stuart. Our understanding, and of course the implementation advisory group that the Scottish Government set up, has involved a work stream looking specifically at the creation of a scheme administrator. Our understanding is that Scottish Government officials were advised that for them to actually set up a scheme administrator themselves would effectively breach state procurement legislation, which requires an open procurement process that is open to everybody to participate in. So that is one of the reasons why government is hoping that a scheme administrator emerges from the producers who are going to be obliged under these regulations. There is much discussion about this. The issues that Jim touched on earlier on in relation to the timetable are a very serious but practical ones for businesses to go out and raise £26 million, which is the estimated cost of setup for a DRS system in Scotland, is quite challenging when you don't have a business already with a track record that you can go and use as a basis for securing loans from commercial banks. It means businesses having to provide guarantees without the certainty that there won't be changes along the line in terms of how the system operates and whether or not it goes ahead as planned currently. So there are some pragmatic challenges there.
So just to squeeze that down to its essentials, the inhibition to the industry, or industries plural, taking action on setting it up now is a purely financial one in getting a guarantee for that 26 million, which is the estimated cost.
It's not purely financial. There is also the certainty required from simply having the regulations having completed their parliamentary process so that there's absolute clarity.
Well, I'm going to come on to that as well. But I think I heard a qualified yes to that question. So therefore, we've also discussed about where power should lie, whether with ministers or with the administrator. So is one of the key things that would enable us to make faster progress and be more flexible and fleet of foot as we understand through implementation the practicalities, that essentially the government retreats from any detailed input on this beyond setting the objectives and lets the administrator, working with the industries concerned, put it out. So therefore, you can get started and get going.
I think from a previous response I made to the convener, it is the case that good general practice from schemes that operate effectively internationally is for government to set the targets, for government to set the objectives, and for then the scheme administrator to go away and ensure that it comes up with the right policies and procedures to meet those targets. what you've just surmised there is actually good international practice.
I think I'm hearing you right. It makes sense that someone can go ahead and start laying the ground rules, and that seems sensible. And Zero Waste Scotland, I think, are starting to do that. However, we have concerns about that because they're going to hit. I think there's a pressure on them to hit a deadline in May 2021, and therefore. You know, they're getting impatient that industry can't make progress. Industry can't make progress for very good reasons. It's not that we're procrastinating. It's because until we see the final regulation, we can't see how this whole thing sits on the ground in hard logistical terms at the very least. We can't say how the IT systems work. And they will have, Zero Waste Scotland will have exactly the same problems. So they're actually going ahead and trying to plan something that they don't know either. I don't understand how they're going to do that very sensibly, and it could be that the further ahead they go, the more we're going to have to unravel before we get started.
Are the IT systems of other countries available for purchase?
Well, for instance, a question that we heard everyone discussing earlier on in the first roundtable was, will glass be included or not? Now, that's a substantial question. Unless you can answer that question, it's very difficult to understand what size of equipment you need in the sheds, what equipment you need. It's not just in the retail premises, it's how you handle that material.
Do forgive me, I think we're now a couple of phases further down the line from the area I'm trying to examine, which is simply getting this administrator in place to start and to see what powers they should have. Because my instincts say the more powers the administrator has, and the more the government simply is setting the objectives, the faster progress we're likely to make, because that administrator will be accountable as a private sector individual to the industry. Is that a fair comment?
I had our hand up, and then I'm going to come to you and McDonald Russell.
Thank you. It's just a very quick response to the question about whether or not glass should be included. The Cabinet Secretary did commit to glass being included, and so that actually doesn't have to be a question. We could accept that that's the system that she's committed to. And I understand that we have to scrutinise the regulations, but that's the commitment.
You and McDonald Russell.
On that, I actually agree with the premise you're saying. The more powers the scheme administrator, the easier for the discussions to have. At the moment, that's not how the regulations lay this out. The deposit level, retailer exemptions, what timeframes look like, and a huge myriad of other things government's keeping. And I guess that's really challenging when we're facing legally binding targets, and whoever are the directors of this company could potentially face, you know, real sanctions, including criminal penalties for missing targets that we don't necessarily believe they've actually got the levers potentially to achieve. That's a huge impediment to people looking at it, because we're having to consider a huge set of liabilities and go through that kind of process. And I think we are concerned at the moment the design government has presented allows them to simultaneously be on the pitch but also the referee, and I don't necessarily think that's going to lead to a good outcome.
Susan Love.
Just a very brief point. I mean, I take the point about the easiest way to get this done is to give more flexibility to the scheme administrator. I suppose just one concern that we do have is that if the majority of premises are going to be run by small businesses, but they're only responsible for a tiny amount of the containers that will be brought in, and they're inexpensive to get to places, that small businesses and the needs of rural and remote communities don't end up at the back of the queue in whatever system we set up. And if we're trying to do it quickly and we want to do it in the most cost-efficient way, we need to think through what the accountability is going to be to make sure that small businesses and those in rural areas aren't disadvantaged by however the scheme administrator decides to be set up. And probably SEPA is key there in terms of the role it plays in approving plans of the scheme administrator.
Okay, we have 3 more people wanting to make a view, and then we're going to have to wind up because we are running out of time. Come to Andrew Tye first.
So just two final points, if I may. One was just on the scheme administrator and the importance. I think it's been mentioned already. When the regulations are passed and the scheme administrator bids, or someone puts in a bid to run the scheme administrator, you know, that £26 million or whatever is needed in terms of loan funding to set up, to build accounting centres, you know, that needs to be available for the scheme administrator to access in the form of loans. So that's something, because for individual producers, obviously that's going to be quite a challenge to fund that themselves, you know, without any sort of commercial facilities to do that. And the second point, which just we haven't really touched on, was just I wanted to make about pubs as well. Obviously, there's going to be some challenges for small businesses and small pubs in relation to the storage of materials under DRS. You know, most pubs will be doing 300 to 400 glass bottles a week, which are going to have a value now, so they won't be able to just put them in the wheelie bins outside, but are going to have some secure storage or to store them inside. And again, it's important in the regulations that allowance is made for that. And at the moment, in the draft regulations, we're not sure that's fully allowed for. So just 2 points I just wanted to make just before we finished.
Before we come to Colin, the two Collins, Mark,